It's my pleasure to welcome to the second panel of today of this great initiative that is about capabilities. And the main objective of this session is to delve into the role of capabilities in informing competition policy. And we will start with a presentation, followed by a discussion from distinguished panelists, each bringing unique insights to this dynamic topic. So let me briefly introduce all of them quickly. So we have Nicolas. He's professor of competition law at the Department of Law and of the European University Institute. His research in recent years has focused on European and US competition law, competition innovation, law and economics, and law in a context of technological change. And thank you for organizing this great initiative, and thanks for being a great host. Then we have David. David is a professor in global business and director of the Tasher Center for the Management of Intellectual Capital at University of California, Berkeley School of Business. And his research includes matters of industrial organization, technological change, and innovation, particularly as it relates to antitrust and competition policy and intellectual property. So without further ado, let's begin with our presentation. So Nicolas, you want to? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Valentina, for being a great chair. You said I was a great host. It's just half a day into the conference. You can still change your minds if you think that. Okay, so I'm going to introduce some work that David and myself have been trying to develop. And this is not even preliminary work. It's really ideas that we are throwing there. We are hoping to progress towards a paper. So when I met David, I was interested in his ideas on dynamic competition. And David gave me a call when I wrote my book a few years ago, and he said, oh, this is so important, we need to push the dynamic competition work up front, which we did. And as I got more interested into David's work, I realized that another leg of his work involves something that he calls and others call dynamic capabilities. And I started to look into this, and I immediately made a connection between those concepts, or the two legs. And for some reason, David, for some time, was a little reluctant to connect these two fields of research and knowledge. So I pushed again, and I think I convinced David that these two things can work together and actually have a lot of cross-relevance for each other. So I'm not going to introduce what dynamic capabilities are. I just want to tell you what we're going to talk about today. David will do the heavy work of describing what dynamic capabilities are, and I will try to explain why dynamic capabilities matter to dynamic competition and to dynamic competition policy, right? We should not confuse economic competition and competition policy, and this is a very bad mistake to make. So what we're going to do in the talk is introduce dynamic capabilities and then discuss about possible areas of relevance for dynamic competition and dynamic competition policy in practice. And with that, David, I hand over to you.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. And yes, indeed, you have pushed me to relate the capabilities framework to dynamic competition. So let me just take, 2 or 3 minutes to talk a little bit about the importance of understanding capabilities, because in my view and in our view, the absence of capabilities from the corpus of competition economics is a major handicap. It's a major omitted variable problem. You cannot understand business conduct and business behavior unless you understand incentives, which economists have that bit right, but you must also understand strategy, and you must also understand the capabilities of organizations, what they can do and what they can't do. Just think about mergers. You're asked to determine with a merger, does it tend to create a monopoly? How can you answer that without knowing something about capabilities, the direction of travel, and so forth? If you're looking at monopoly questions and monopoly power and whether it will dissipate, or where did it come from, you have to know something about capabilities. But if you go to the economics textbooks, whether it's Halvarian's textbooks or whoever, zero in the index under capabilities. Why? Is it because economists don't think capabilities matter? No, it's not. It's because they don't know how to analyze them. And so we have been going through this dance for a century and a half of putting all of our eggs into explaining exchange and complex forms of business behavior, but absent any kind of framework for thinking about capabilities. And so that's why scholars such as myself and Connie Helfat and others here on the panel have devoted time to thinking about capabilities of organizations and how that affects competitive advantage. We didn't start this exercise thinking about competition policy. We went after the grand question that everybody's interested in. How do firms get to be great and stay great? Or can they stay great? How do you build sustainable competitive advantage? That is the key question that animates the field of strategic management. It's the question that most executives wake up thinking about every day. It's the question that stock analysts wake up thinking about every day. It's the question that politicians think about every day. So we need to have some kind of framework to deal with this. Why isn't it in economics? Because it's mathematically inconvenient. It's hard to model. We saw Areopagus take us to the edge of what you can do, and it's hard, it's complex. So the truth of the matter is the field is being lazy. It's stuck with static frameworks because that's easy, and you can appear to be smart. But the real world is complex, and without a capabilities framework, you can't go very far. So what are capabilities? They are the set of skills and routines that enable organizations to do things. What things? Well, if it's a matter of creating, a defined product and doing that well, we call that ordinary capabilities. Actually, I thank Connie for this, Connie and Sid, because I talked about dynamic capabilities for a long time, and I realized people didn't understand what I was talking about, so I had to talk about what they're not. They're not ordinary capabilities. Ordinary capabilities are best practices. Ordinary capabilities are what the textbook is filled with because efficiency is driven by ordinary capabilities. Give me a defined task. Give me a defined product. If I can do that efficiently, that's an ordinary capability. A dynamic capability, on the other hand, is about how do you change the resource base? How do you stay relevant for changing market circumstances? And clearly in the world of technology and deep uncertainty, it's dynamic capabilities that distinguish firms that are winners from those that are losers. So we have tried to build frameworks or at least some starting definitions so that we can get to building a framework. And actually, just go back one there, Nicolas. So we define dynamic capabilities as doing the right things. Actually, this is a distinction that Peter Drucker made years ago. There's a question of doing things right, which is what efficiency is about, or doing the right things, which is what dynamic capability is about. By the right things, I mean the right products, the right offerings to customers, the right services. Figuring that out ahead of the competition and being able to implement that is what a capability is. And how can you understand potential competition unless you understand capabilities? How can you understand how durable market power is without understanding capabilities? Or how can you understand the source of market power without understanding capabilities? So that's why we have tried to put some structure around dynamic capabilities. And I've found it useful to distinguish between three different buckets of underlying processes and activities that are foundational to dynamic capabilities. There's sensing and sense-making, which is figuring out where the market's going, figuring out where the technology is going, not just observing it, not just sensing it, but also, cognitively making sense of it. So I'm using sensing as a placeholder for not just figuring out what's happening, but also making sense of it, because we can all look at the same data and come up with different conclusions as to what's going on. But even if you figure out what's going on in the market, you then have to be able to execute. That's what I call seizing. So execution, investment, and so forth has to follow sensing. If you don't invest behind the opportunity, you won't get anywhere. And even if you do get someplace, markets change, technology change, and you've got to transform. So organizations that are great and stay great have to continuously be sensing, seizing, and transforming. They have to have dynamic capabilities. By the way, governments do too, for that matter. But this concept so far has only been worked through in terms of the private marketplace and private enterprise. And as Nicolas here has created the slides, which are very interesting to me, and he's identified a group of activities that sit above these big buckets. New product development, M&A activity, brand building, all of these things are part of dynamic capabilities. So I refer to dynamic capabilities as really a workable systems theory. I mean, we have to think systems. Capabilities theory is the best friend of complexity economics and vice versa. We're not simplifying things down to make it elegant and possible to model it. We're looking at reality as it is, trying to make sense of things. So this, I think, is there another slide or is that about it? Let's move on beyond that. Let me sort of try and summarize a little bit before I hand it over to Nicolas what this all means. It means when applied to competition economics, it leads to a different understanding and a different focus. It says focusing on innovation and change is the primary driver of competition. That's why it's not just about competition driving innovation, but organizations that have strong dynamic capabilities innovate and drive competition. So all of competition economics sees competition flowing one way to innovation, and surely that is correct, but there's endogeneity here. And we pay attention in the capabilities framework to this endogeneity that, in fact, organizations that have strong dynamic capabilities drive innovation as much as innovation drives competition. So we have those considerations. And I think just to sort of underscore what's going on, I think that today, and we mentioned the Draghi report earlier, and just 2 weeks ago there was comments by Keir Starmer in the UK saying competition policy must pay attention to economic growth and development. And these things have been, they're not been good bedfellows. You've got competition policy over here, and you've got industrial policy over here, and competitiveness is a word we use in the United States. The research on competitiveness of the enterprise and of the nation state is not connected to competition policy. Doesn't that tell you there's something wrong? And that's what I saw in the Draghi report and also in the comments from Keir Starmer saying the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK has to pay attention to the competitiveness of the nation state. Well, we've got disparate frameworks. Our job here with dynamic competition is to pull these frameworks together so that competitiveness and competition policy can live together rather than be at war with each other.
So I'll take over from there. It's always very difficult to take over from David. But I want to focus on a few concrete things in the rest of the presentation. So I'll flip through that. Okay. So I'm not a capability scholar, and I'm certainly making no claim that I know a lot about this, but I've been spending a lot of time with the works of David and the works of Connie and the works of others like Peter Merman, who will be attending or is attending the conference. And what I drove from that is this idea, this basic idea that managers and organization matters, right? So it's not only about institutions, and it's not only about price signals and output signals, and there's more complexity here. Now, capabilities tend to be defined in the literature as firm-specific competences, skills, knowledge, and experience. that is, to a certain extent, repeatable, right? So that's why you see the little books here. And okay, and these capabilities of firms, they support a lot of activities that business organizations try to develop, like new product building, brand building, demand building, post-merger asset integration, asset release, redeployment in some lines of business, and so on and so forth, right? One interesting insight from the literature is that sometimes these capabilities can be studied by looking at whether firms have these routines and protocols and blueprints and processes where knowledge resides, right? It's much harder, of course, when you want to assess whether a manager is a good manager for the company, but firms leave traces of their capabilities in the organization, right? So that, I think, is useful because it gives us an insight that studying capabilities can allow us to answer some technical questions that antitrust evaluation experts try to address, right? And this is, as David mentioned, very true when the incentive sprung of the ability and incentive fails to provide clear predictions, right? And this can be due to a number of factual circumstances. For instance, the analysis is very forward-looking. You want to take the telescope to look into the long term. Or you're facing a very new or immature market in which business models have not yet settled on a particular type, and the payoffs are very unclear, right? So studying incentives will not provide extremely clear data points. Now, we know that in antitrust practice, agencies and institutions have tended to, when the signals from incentives are not very clear, there has been a tendency to rely on internal documents to establish purpose or intent, right, as an additional factor that drives the fact-finding. But even if you study intent, so for instance, you would like to study intent knowing whether the merged entity in a transaction had the intention to discontinue lines of early R&D research or pipeline products. The question is not so much knowing whether it wants to do it or whether it has incentives to do it. One relevant question and antecedent question may be, can it do it? Right? It's not a given that all the assets of R&D are completely flexible and can be repurposed in the business organization. It's not a given that they're going to be seller in this market. So the question of can the firm do it is extremely important, and agencies and institutions have engaged with these questions in cases and decisions and judgments, but they have done that without a very good framework, and maybe the capabilities literature can help supply a better framework to deal with these questions. Okay, so I'm going to try to show you the type of technical questions that these capabilities lens can help with in merger evaluation. And this is very preliminary, but all the issues that we are going to discuss in the next minutes relate to the long-term innovation and survival and growth. Okay. All right, so to start, long-term horizon questions arise when agencies, for instance, consider the policy of entry from suppliers of imperfect substitutes following a merger. So potential competition analysis is typically relevant to a competitive assessment as a moderator for a finding of short-term market power. Okay? So that's how we think about it. One case in which capabilities or a capabilities lens could help is a case like, close to what we saw in Siemens Alstom, for instance. So for those of you who don't know the case or who don't recall the case well, my understanding is that the Commission blocked the acquisition, the combination of Siemens and Alstom on account of a large dominant position being created in high-speed and very high-speed trains that go faster than 250 kilometers. And in the case, the Commission refused to credit the threat of entry of CRRC, the large train manufacturer from China, considering that CRC would not be a credible bidder in the years following the transaction. Okay? So the EC in its assessment used testimonies from the rivals to the merger to establish that it would take more than 5 years for CRC to be a credible bidder. By contrast, the EC refused to credit the testimony of the customers of Siemens and Alstom, the buyers from Siemens and Alstom, that CRC could enter into a 3 to 5 years horizon. Right? So this is settling this testimonial dispute between both sets of interests could be one area in which a capabilities framework may cast some light. So unfortunately, it's very hard to see anything in the black box of Chinese SOEs, as we know, and it would have been very difficult to study the capabilities of that company, but that framework can provide some insights into these types of questions. Okay, another area in which these capabilities profile or frameworks may help is in relation to the evaluation of innovation competition. Okay, so one case that it could be helpful to consider or illustrate the relevance of a capabilities framework is the abandoned merger between Adobe and Figma. So the theory in this case, as I understand it, was that Adobe, post-merger, would abandon its own innovation effort into product design software and only maintaining the product design software of Figma, right? And the theory of the case seems to be that the merger removes rivalry between two innovation competitors, right? So the loss in innovation competition in that case assumes that Adobe has the product development capabilities sufficient to compete with Figma, right? Now, the evidence on the record showed that Adobe had struggled to develop a product software design tool and had actually ceased to push this product, reallocating engineers and so on and so forth before the merger, days before the merger. The CMA in its decision considered that this was proof that indeed the merger was all about reducing innovation competition, but a capability lens would tell you that maybe Adobe was just repurposing lines of research and product development to the company with the best capabilities to develop the product, right? So here, you could also have relevance for a capability lens. Third, a capability lens can help in relation to what the Draghi report calls for, which is an innovation defense. So I'm pretty sure, I will not find disagreement with many economic practitioners here that raising an efficiency defense in merger cases is fairly high bar to cross, and raising an innovation defense in a merger case is an even higher bar to cross, right? So Draghi in his report say that we need to develop and formulate in merger guidelines in the EU a better framework to credit innovation defenses. And again here, it is a possibility that a capabilities framework could help formulate that, right? So if you take again what I just mentioned about the loss of innovation competition, if you take a case like Dow DuPont, where the Commission established that the merger would lead to the discontinuation of certain substitute R&D pipelines after the transaction would be implemented. One question that was not asked in this case, but that would have been relevant to study under a capabilities mind, was to know whether the elimination of pipelines of research would incentivize and allow the companies to develop, repurpose some of these R&D assets, which are quite inflexible, towards other innovation targets, right? And to study this, you don't need really to just go for the incentive thing, but you may want to start by studying whether the company has a track record of repurposing or reallocating teams to explore new research directions, right? And there are works in the capabilities literature on what they call, if I'm not mistaken, repositioning capabilities, right? And some firms have very strong repositioning capabilities, other firms have very weak repositioning capabilities, and the credibility of an efficiency defense may have to be evaluated on that ground. Okay, I close with the $1 billion, I mean, I don't know, $100 billion, question that has fascinated the antitrust community these past years with big claims, I would say, about what should have been done in this case. The Facebook Instagram acquisition. So I think the jury is still out on whether it was a good idea to let Facebook buy Instagram. Some people have very strong views about this. They said this was the big mistake that I think the OFT did back in the day. The OFT was the controlling authority. Okay. So the question of whether the Facebook-Instagram merger should have been prohibited hinges on a key question, which is a capability question. The question is this: but for the acquisition, would Instagram have been able to survive and grow independently? Right? So critics of the decision to let the merger go assume this is the case, that Instagram could have grown organically and become a competitor to Facebook. Now, a capability profile assessment of the company could help adjudicate that question of whether the target business can grow alone or whether it cannot. And an acquisition, probably by Facebook in the case, is the best way to keep the product and service in the market, right? Okay, so this is, I think, the sort of various technical and interesting questions where capabilities framework can serve. I want to say one last word to close and let Valentina take over for the panel. So I want to say a word about why it is interesting to do this. So the neo-Brandeisians, as we sometimes call them, have offered to respond to the increased complexity of the economy with politicization, right? What this kind of work and what you heard on the previous panel and that what you will hear in the next panels offers to answer the complexification of the economy by reason and research and interdisciplinarity. I think this is the better agenda, and it's an agenda which is very much in the antitrust tradition, at least in Europe. We enriched vertical restraints law by use of transaction cost economics. We enriched horizontal collusion law by reference to game theory, importing insights from game theory. We enriched single firm conduct law by insights from behavioral economics. So what we are proposing here in the paper and more broadly in the conference is to create this process of disciplined heterodoxy, where we are going to try to look at the margins, what we can derive from other fields of economic and business and management science. I think we need to do this if we don't want the exercise to become completely discretionary and end up into I know it when I see it legal policy. So thanks for your attention.